Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for Wolf & Company's webinar on the topic ransomware, how attackers deploy and how you can stop it. My name is Stephanie Creedon, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. During today's presentation, members of Wolf & Company will be discussing how ransomware has become a global issue, costing organizations across every corporate vertical billions of dollars each year. Industries have been significantly impacted over the past year, with malicious actors capitalizing on the fear and panic surrounding COVID-19. Today, we'll be detailing the anatomy of ransomware attack and how it can negatively affect your organization and tips for prevention and protection. But before we get started, I'd just like to review a few housekeeping items. Today's presentation will last about 2 hours and will consist of some live demos. The presentation will be recorded and available after the conclusion of the event. Attendees will receive a copy of the presentation as well as a link to the recording in a follow-up email. The format of today's webinar is structured as a Zoom webinar. All attendees are muted throughout the presentation. If you'd like to submit a question, please do so at any time by using the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom control panel. We'll have plenty of time for questions at the end of the webinar. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce today's presenters, Michael Canarellis, Principal at Wolf & Company, and Joe Sarkisian, Lead Pen Tester at Wolf & Company. So thank you both for presenting today and sharing your expertise with the group. I'm now going to hand it over to Mike from Wolf & Company to get us started.
Thanks, Stephanie. And certainly want to start by saying I appreciate everyone taking time out of their day. Certainly the attendance to the webinar, I think, speaks to, the state of the current environment and, how frightening ransomware can be. And certainly organizations through all verticals are being affected by it. So whether you're a bank, credit union, hospital, manufacturer, or tech company, these are issues that certainly need to be addressed. And I think by understanding and, dedicating some money to the overall budget to perform these type of exercises is really is a good first step, to tackling the problem. With that, we can. So just to kind of briefly go through, we went through the introductions. I'm going to speak very briefly on the current landscape. I don't want to spend too much time. We've all seen it in the news, with the current campaign against critical infrastructure. Certainly, high value targets have been in the news on almost a daily basis. So, but just to give some numbers and some perspective to what we're talking about, I think we should spend a little time on. And then we're going to get into I'm going to hand it off to Joe, and we're going to get into the substantive portion where Joe's certainly going to walk through. And this is not an educational exercise. Joe is in the field as one of Wolf & Company's lead penetration testers doing this work on a daily basis. We have certainly performed these exercises. It's really ramped up over the past 16 months, but even before then, this is work we're doing on a daily basis within financial institutions, healthcare institutions, manufacturers, and investment management and technology. You're seeing more companies realize that this is an issue that needs to be addressed. Joe's gonna, have some narrative, but also go into some demos of showing you actual command line and functionally how Joe and the rest of the Wolf & Company penetration testing team, gets access and will, move laterally across the network. Certainly give you some actionable items, what you can do. So I'm hoping and I'm fairly confident that you'll have some actionable items from this presentation that you can go back, whether communicating to your technical folks or infrastructure folks, or if you're a large enough organization and have a risk group that's performing this testing for you. Certainly spot check, are they including these type of things in their testing? Give you some additional resources, and then obviously some closing remarks and open it up for questions. So real briefly, who's Wolf and Company? So we were established quite some time ago and have been doing business since 1911. We're a traditional CPA firm with 3 core lines of service: audit, tax, and risk management. I will mention what makes us a little different than most CPA firms is the IT audit, security, and specifically technical cyber talent that Wolf and Company is lucky enough to have. And it's one of the fastest growing areas of the firm. And certainly something we've been hyper focused on, over the last 10 years, and specifically regarding ransomware, over the last 5 years. We're over 300 professionals, which makes us a top 100 CPA firm nationally. Our offices span pretty much the East Coast. We just opened up a Miami office, but we're really projecting nationally, especially within our risk management services group in lines of service like penetration testing. Wolf and Company has professionals in, I believe, 35 states. We have clients in 45 states. So service lines like penetration testing, threat emulation, red team, blue team, purple teaming exercises is really a national service line for the firm. So I'm just going to briefly touch on the current landscape, why we thought it was critical to have this webinar and to have some knowledge transfer. And these are numbers that aren't surprising to folks, I'm assuming. But there's certainly what we're seeing, what the CrowdStrike report indicates, what the Verizon data breach report, indicates, are these type of numbers where this is really financially motivated. In healthcare specifically, we've done a lot of analysis. Someone's patient record, on the dark web can go upwards of $10 a patient record. So if you get 100, 1,000, 100,000, that's a large financial windfall. And certainly in the financial institution market, when you're looking at client data and just using overall data for identity theft, these attackers are coordinated, they're sophisticated. In the days of kind of the script kiddie approach has long since gone. One of the key numbers that I would point people to related to doing things like ransomware reviews and threat emulation exercises is really that ancillary benefit, and really a core benefit of you've spent sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars on deploying security tools. And one of the areas that we've seen consistently when we're performing these exercises is really a failure within the tools to detect the lateral movement on the network. And that's going to really be the hallmark of ransomware or malware in general, is really that once a machine is compromised, detecting that rapid file encryption, which is a hallmark of ransomware, and lateral movement of the ransomware itself, and being able to have your tools detect it. So a lot of our findings when we're doing these type of exercises are related to tuning of your current product mix, making sure that they're tuned properly to detect this type of activity, and certainly point out where, additional tools that need to be budgeted for. If that's the case, certainly calling that out during the engagement. And then the last number is, this is going to be a consistent problem, for the foreseeable future, where, after doing that post-incident response analysis is really going to uncover that this is going to be something that comes back time and time again. And so having your tools, your personnel, really people, process, and technology able to pivot, and consistently testing people, process, and technology is really the way to go. So training, testing, implementation, training, testing, implementation is really that rhythm that we're looking for. Again, this is just kind of, the different variations of what we're seeing in the quote unquote wild, really big game hunters, looking for that major score. And then there's that more repetitive kind of numbers game of ransomware as a service, seeing things that are wide and broad in scope, knocking at the door countless times and playing that numbers game of seeing what the low-hanging fruit is, one, and then developing more coordinated attacks through phishing emails and spear phishing, to target individuals within the organization, where those criminals are making a judgment that, based on their social engineering, they can assume that these 5 people are going to have local admin rights on the network, or have those domain and network credentials to really help those attackers in their lateral movement, and getting ultimately to that payload, whatever the payload is in that criminal's eyes, whether it's customer data at a bank, or electronic protected health information at a healthcare organization or a hospital or health insurer, certainly manufacturing data, that can be sold, or, within pharma, we see some really coordinated attacks, looking to get to drug information or M&A activity, where if someone knows that a target is a public company is being targeted for acquisition, can use that information to manipulate stock prices. So we've seen it across the board, and attackers certainly don't discriminate, and will adapt and pivot to whatever environment they're in. And that shifting of tools, payloads, and activities, and as you kind of peel back the onion and look at some of the more sophisticated attackers out there, you almost see this corporate structure where they're developing campaigns where they're going to be hitting East Coast hospitals and banks in the US in Q1, and then they're going to move to the Midwest and then to the West Coast. So you see this type of thoughtfulness and coordination to these type of attacks that you haven't seen in the past. So with that, I will hand off to Joe Sarkeesian, who I mentioned is one of Wolf & Company's lead penetration testers, and is doing this work on a daily and consistent basis, and really coordinating our penetration testing team's approach throughout. And I will mention before I hand it off, it really spans that whole spectrum of testing. Everything from doing daily, monthly, quarterly vulnerability scans across the enterprise to inform you on your patch management activities, to be alerted to any key out of date or non-supported OSs in the environment, to really helping with your overall patch management on a more consistent basis through traditional external, internal, wireless, and application level penetration testing, which would be that next step up, to, from a gray box perspective, really look at your external and internal presence in a more targeted approach, and trying to catch things that traditional vulnerability scans would not. And then moving to what we're going to be speaking about today, that next evolution in testing, to move to a more real world scenario and trying to emulate what's actually happening. And so that one is going to help inform you on what type of policy, procedures, and tools that you're going to have to be able to pivot to this more coordinated attack. So that's really the overall kind of spectrum of testing, and we're just trying to inform the marketplace on what's possible. What type of testing can we do today that's really going to help create a corrective action plan that we can methodically mitigate over time? Certainly any high vulnerabilities or high risk findings you're going to want to remediate immediately, but you're also going to want to take those moderate and low findings and put them into a corrective action plan that you can really carve out and create ownership within the organization on how these areas are going to be, how these vulnerabilities are going to be mitigated by additional controls. So with that, Joe, I will hand it off to you to just try to, for the next couple of slides, giving a primer before you get into the substantive part of your discussion.
Sure. Thanks, Mike. Thanks for everybody coming. Yeah, so I'm sure that everybody has kind of seen a slide that looks like this, right? So people start, the attackers start, how do they get initial access, right? So they're digging for credentials, they're poking at your perimeter, right? They're doing things like that. Once they do get in, there's some type of code execution potentially, right? Credentialed access, lateral movement to see kind of, what's out there, what they could potentially go after once they're inside the environment. Where are the databases? Where is the data? Where are the file shares, right? And then the payload, right? The payload being ransomware. They start actually encrypting things. You get the notification on the screen. Oh my God, time to call incident response, right? So that's kind of the general feel for a lot of attackers, regardless of whether it's ransomware, other type of malware, whatever it may be. So based on this slide and the steps involved, you have what a lot of people have probably heard of, MITRE ATT&CK. So this is a framework that basically tracks specific tactics, techniques, and procedures that a lot of these attackers use in order to get access to your environment, right? So the way it's kind of broken down is, we have what motivates attackers, and specific groups of attackers. It's financial, whatever it may be, right? And then the actual techniques they use to get into your environment, and those are all listed out. And you can see like credentialed access might be a category, and then there's subcategories of that. And it's what do they do to get that access? What do different actual APT groups and other types of organizations like them use to get access, right? So you can see there's a lot of techniques, there's a lot of sub techniques. And what you can do is use this information. It's all publicly available on MITRE's website to kind of map out what a specific threat actor might do, right? How do they get credentials? Once they have them, how do they get inside? Once they're inside, what do they do? What's typical for this type of organization, right? So it's an invaluable tool. There's a lot of bolt-ons, so to speak, from third parties that leverage MITRE ATT&CK to better help organizations determine what's going on in their environment. And we at Wolf, use it all the time, and we're using it more and more every day to try to help in this ever-growing cesspool of APTs and threats to try to see what's going on out there. So with that, we're going to get into some of the meat and potatoes of this presentation, right? How we get in. And it's not just how we get in, it's how threat actors in general get in, okay? So initial access, right? There's three things that when we're on assessments, we look for all the time when we're doing external penetration test type work. So that could be susceptibility to phishing campaigns. So we do a lot of phishing campaigns at Wolf for our clients. What that looks like is we work with clients to figure out, a ruse that we're going to send. We're oftentimes testing people, not necessarily technologies in place, because people want to tell, how susceptible are our employees to a phishing attack. There's no such thing as perfect. Some do better than others. We look for reporting. That's very important. The faster you report, the faster you can figure out what's going on and remediate, right? But still, we always get clickers. We always get credentials. It's still a problem. As you can see in a lot of the reports out there, the Verizon DBIR that came out recently, the past several years, this has been a major issue. Weak passwords. Everybody hates passwords. Attackers love passwords because oftentimes those passwords are not the best. And you'll see that in a lot of our, going forward when we do some of the demos, just kind of an example of what I mean there. But, things like spring 2021 exclamation point. To this day, those things still work for us and we still get access with those. There are a lot of solutions out there. Microsoft has a lot of solutions that you can implement. Obviously, it's going to cost you. There are some free tools that can help you with that. And then there's, third-party apps or third-party tools that can help you with that as well. Office 365 and Microsoft 365 misconfigurations, right? So we're going to talk about those in depth, but I'm talking about things like thinking you're turning off legacy authentication protocols when actually they're not all turned off, or other types of privileged access, too many accounts with admin rights, right? Not realizing who actually has admin rights to what. And that can help attackers move laterally, get more credentials, get more access to your internal network once they're there. So like I said, phishing. As of late, obviously within the last, say 15 months at this point, something like that, we send a lot of pandemic related, remote work related phish. You can see that in the attacker space, the actual attacker space as well. And I have an example of one of those in the next slide. But we can use credentials that we get from phishing to bypass perimeter defenses, even multi-factor authentication, which we're going to see soon as well. Employees are more susceptible to social engineering when they're working from home or wherever they're working. There's not as much of a cohesive unit necessarily in an office where if a phish comes through, somebody can jump up and be like, don't click on that, right? So maybe it'll come through on Teams, maybe it'll come through on Skype chat, but I think the time to picking up on it is a little bit longer. And I think I've noticed that a lot of our phishing campaigns have been more successful in the last year or so than they were prior. Again, it's always going to be an issue, but it is what it is. Now that we're coming out of, COVID, coming out of that pandemic, we'll see how those things kind of take shape and the things that attackers start using more and more often as far as pretexts to get people to click, but we're not there yet. So here's an example of a phishing email that we actually sent. And this is basically playing off that idea of the pandemic, right? So I'm sure people, especially the IT folks at organizations, have seen a million of these come through. This is a similar scenario that you've probably seen, trying to figure out how comfortable people are coming back to the office now that COVID's kind of slowing down. We want to take a poll. Please, click on this link, go to this site, use your work credentials to log in and answer the questions presented, right? And so then we'll have whoever the company may be, we'll use their logo, right? We'll look at their signature, figure out how it looks, change it so that it looks very legitimate, and then we'll send that off and we'll see what happens, right?
I know. I know another one, Joe, just to not to cut you off. One that I've seen being really successful that we've used is around the PPP loan application process. So, I'm sure there's folks on the call whose organizations applied for the payment protection program relief, and certainly, we've made those type of emails look pretty official, and we've seen. So, just to on Joe's point, really taking advantage of the current environment and using topical information in the phishing attacks has been problematic for organizations that we've tested.
So the link that I referenced on this page, that site link, would take someone to a page that looks like this. So it looks like a pretty legitimate Microsoft sign-in page. They enter their email, then they enter their password. We capture that on the back end. And then we'll probably bring them to some type of an error page, if this try again later type of thing, right? To try to not necessarily get them to, reach out to IT right away. Just to let the campaign run and see what kind of results we get. But I mean, the Microsoft sign-in page gets a lot of people. So initial access, as we talked about in that MITRE slide, right? So how are we getting it? How are attackers getting it? So one tactic that we use all the time is password spraying. So what is that, right? Password spraying is I gather a user list from several places, and I'm going to show a couple of those. First of all, I figure out what the email structure is. Is it first last at so-and-so.com? Is it first dot last, et cetera, et cetera. Once we figure that out, we gather a user list, right? We can do that via LinkedIn with certain tools we have. There's a couple others I'll show, but we'll take that massive user list of, say, I don't know, let's say we have 1,000 emails, right? 1,000 logins. We'll take each one of those and try spring 2021 exclamation point for every single one of those accounts. And more often than not, we get at least one hit on something like that. Then we'll try, for instance, company name 2021 exclamation point, and so on and so forth, right? And what we do is we do that over time, low and slow, so that we're not setting off any alarm bells necessarily for the organization. And obviously, the more and more users we can, user credentials we can harvest that way, the more access to data we might have, right? If we get, say 3 basic users and then we get a 4th that's an admin, right? That's a big deal for an attacker. All right, demo time. Not too bad, only a half hour in. You had to listen to me talk. So I'm going to show what this looks like. So here we have some of the more technically minded folks on the call may have seen this before. This is what's called Kali Linux. So this is a penetration testing Linux platform, has a lot of bad guy tools pre-installed on it. This one is not, but it's called Spraying Toolkit. So this is a group of scripts that attackers can use to essentially automate the password spraying process, right? So before I run this, I want to show, for instance, I've had clients ask me, well, how do you get credentials in the first place? This is one of those places. So there's a website called phonebook.cz. I can put in any company domain. So for instance, we'll do Wolf & Co. Search for email addresses, and voila. There's a big long list of email addresses there I can now use to password spray against. It's that simple. Now, I'm not going to guarantee these are all still valid or these people still work here, but over time, this is what's been put on this website that was valid at some point, right? So I'm going to take this entire list, put it in, add it to my list before I start. Then there's paid tools or free ones like Hunter.io, which some people have probably heard of. That's probably a little bit better known, especially in marketing circles, things like that. Same thing, Wolf & Co. Now, these are going to be much better results than the previous one because these are updated more frequently, right? You can see that these are verified by Hunter. Oh, that's a little early for that, but that's coming. And then obviously I can upgrade if I want to. I don't think it's too expensive as an attacker, certainly not. To just pay a little bit of money to get the whole list. And that list is going to be a pretty good list. So those are two options I have as an attacker. And then we have tools like, where am I? There's a tool called LinkedIn to username. So what that'll do is I can plug my credentials into it. I can make a fake account on LinkedIn. I can then create a fake personality for that person. I can add, without even saying anything or introducing myself, I can just search for banking and that, or healthcare, or whatever it may be. And I can just go add. And then before long, I have 200 plus people who have accepted me. And now I look legitimate, right? I look like I'm in the banking space, or I look like I'm in the healthcare space, whatever it may be. Then I can run my tool. I will find the company's name on LinkedIn, put that into the tool. The tool will spit out a whole bunch of email addresses automatically based on username and password, or I'm sorry, username fields and what they may be at the domain.com. So those three tools, I can build a pretty good list, right? So with that list, I'm going to use this tool, as I mentioned, called Atomizer. What this does, so this is my domain that I set up for this demo, throughout the demo. What you can do is go on Microsoft these days and get a free 365 E5 license for development purposes only. You can't use it for work. Obviously, you got to pay for that, but this is free. So this is a good playground, right? And I highly recommend people doing that if they want to test some of the things that we've done here and for remediation purposes by the end. So that's my domain that I created. That's my target. This is the password I'm going to try, COVID stinks 2021. And then I have my user list. And this is my user list of all the people that I created for this domain, this fake organization, right? So I'm going to hit enter here. So right now it's trying to use auto discover, which is a protocol to find endpoints for mail servers. So that was a lot. Let me go through it real quick, right? So it figures out that the domain's hosted on Office 365, tries another link, finds that, and then starts spraying. So it starts spraying against Microsoft 365, and it's trying each one of these accounts for that password, COVID stinks 2021. And if you see here, we got a hit. So Lydia is using this password. So now we have account credentials for Lydia, right? So now you might be saying, well, what if Lydia has MFA? And we are going to get there, but for now, we have Lydia's credentials. Let's go back to our PowerPoint. So let's go on, right? MFA bypass. We have Lydia's credentials. We can bypass multi-factor, and we do it all the time still. Legacy authentication protocols, some of you may have heard about these, are a big problem, because what they essentially do is allow someone who knows what they're doing to bypass any MFA control that you have in place. So things like Exchange Web Services, that's a legacy protocol, right? It doesn't support multi-factor authentication. So if you're allowing things to authenticate to your 365 environment via this protocol, we can leverage that as attackers to get in. Same thing with ActiveSync. And we're going to see both of these get used in the near future. Auto Discover as well. There's a bunch of other ones. I just listed the ones that are most common and the ones that we are able to leverage most frequently. MFA, right? Not all organizations have it. More and more do. I would say the majority at this point. Most of our clients do. But there is a caveat here. So just because you set up multi-factor authentication, for instance, within a 365 environment, doesn't necessarily mean that it's configured for every single user. So what do I mean by that? Microsoft, when you turn that on and enforce it, typically gives a user, depending upon how it's set, it could be longer, but 14 days to set up a multi-factor account, or multi-factor control on their account. So if an attacker gets a password and that account hasn't been set up yet for MFA, that attacker now owns that account because they can put their phone number in there and now they own that account. They have set up MFA for that account. And we're going to see what that looks like as well. Also, conditional access policies. I'm sure a lot of people have heard this. If you're one of my clients, I beat people over the head with this all the time. Do you use them? If so, what do you use them for? In new tenants, when you set up a tenant in 365, there's something called security defaults, which are turned on by default, hence the name. They have a large amount of controls built in. They get rid of those legacy protocols, like those aren't active when security defaults are on, which gives you a good basic level of protection. And it, depending upon the organization size and the number of users in your use case, you may want to use security defaults. That might be all you need. But a lot of clients are bigger and they're more complex, and they would need to use things called conditional access policies. Now, conditional access policies can be used to block those same legacy protocols. They can be used to, for instance, disallow logins from Iran, right? Why are any of your users trying to log in from an Iranian IP address as, Lydia from HR or whoever, right? That doesn't make much sense unless she's on vacation there. We're going to be surprised. Why are you not being alerted when there are multiple failed attempts, right? You can set up access to, and, along with alerts to figure out if you're being password sprayed like we just did. How is it classified as an attack when this happens to you, things like that. I mean, this is all baked into conditional access policy in your MSSP if they're dealing with that for you or whatnot, right? But the main point is, yes, conditional access policies are great and they can do that, but if you enable them, then security defaults has to be turned off. You can't have both, right? So security defaults provides some good protection against those legacy authentication protocols that we're going to see and use soon, but they got a poll. So I forgot to mention we have a poll, as you may see, and it's, are you confident that your conditional access policies are properly configured to, for instance, disallow logins from unknown locations, disallow legacy authentication protocols, things like that. I think Steph is going to come back and let us know the results in a minute, but we'll carry on until then. So as I was saying, security defaults, right? Turn them off, you're not protected. Turn conditional access policies on, and you've got a nice big headache waiting for you to figure out how to properly tune those so that everything is turned off, it should be turned off, and everything's being kind of locked down the way it's supposed to be. It's not an easy thing to do. When I was setting up this lab environment, I was following Microsoft's guides and I still wasn't getting it right. It just wasn't working right. So sympathy to all of the technical folks out there that have to deal with this, but it is what it is. And it's what we're presented with at the moment to handle these issues. Wow, okay. So are you confident that your access policy is probably configured? We have 65% of participants saying no. We have 35 saying yes. Okay, to know. I appreciate the honesty of those that said no, because it is a hard thing to do. And we'll see kind of what the risk of not having that properly tuned looks like in a second. Oh, one other thing I want to mention on this slide. If you have a security provider that's handling this for you, or if you're contracting with someone to pay attention to logs there, or alert you on things that are going on in 365 or on your perimeter, or whatever it may be. I have some clients where they don't get alerted to this based on the SLA because the contractor calls this a medium risk event. If you're getting password sprayed, that's, in my opinion, that's not a medium risk event, and you need to know about that as it's happening so you can take proper measures. Okay, so I often tell clients that they need to work with their providers to create a higher level of alert for this type of thing. Okay, so another demo. We're gonna do MFA bypass. I'm gonna show you what it looks like. Now that we have Lydia's account credentials, what can I do with them? We're gonna go to our Windows virtual machine. So this virtual machine is basically going to be used as both an attack platform as for an attacker and it's going to be used as theoretical desktop environment for the end user that's being attacked. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So if I'm an attacker, right, and I have access to a Windows 10 environment, I know how to use PowerShell, I'm going to do some more recon now that I have Lydia's credentials and figure out what kinds of security controls like MFA are configured on her account, right? There's a tool called MFA Sweep by a guy named Bo Bullock. Works for Black Hills InfoSec. He wrote this tool. He writes a lot of tools, but this is one we like to use a lot. What this does is attempts to log in with these credentials to those legacy protocol endpoints that are out there if they're not being properly blocked for access. And it will tell me essentially, okay, is MFA configured for one? And for two, is Exchange Web Services a legacy protocol? Is that active? And can I use it to log in? How about ActiveSync, which is another legacy protocol? Can I use that to log in, right? And so on and so forth. So we'll run this and we'll see what that looks like for Lydia's account. First demo problem of the day. Apologies, give me one sec. Okay, there we go. So this can also check for Active Directory federation. Like, is his account federated? I don't care about that right now. Confirm MFA sweep. This is going to try to attempt 6 different logins to those different legacy protocol endpoints, right? I want to see all of this. I know that's a valid password. I'm not worried about locking the account out. None of that. So let's take a look. It's going to go quick, but I'll explain. So it's logging into each one of those endpoints in the environment. ActiveSync takes a second. So these different things, right? Microsoft Graph API. Okay, we know it's a valid account, success, we could log in. I can use the MS Online PowerShell module now with this account to enumerate the environment with remotely. Azure Service Management, similar thing. What I'm really interested in here is this Exchange Web Services right here. This tells me that legacy authentication protocols, or at least EWS, is valid. It's working, and I can use that to bypass multi-factor authentication. And we'll see what that looks like as well with a tool called Mail Sniper right here that I'll show in a minute. The web portal, right? Okay, so that's like if you go to log in on microsoftonline.com. Yes, that's a valid account credential. However, it appears MFA is set up for this account. Okay, appears is a key word here. We'll see why. ActiveSync is taking its sweet time. There we go. Okay. Here's another one to pay attention to. Microsoft 365 web portal login with a mobile user agent. What does that mean? It means that I am taking my browser, right? So say I'm using Chrome, and I'm changing a setting in Chrome so that it looks like I'm authenticating with a cell phone instead of a computer. There are some settings that can be screwed up in conditional access that would allow you to bypass multi-factor authentication simply because you're a cell phone. So that's something to pay attention to in conditional access. ActiveSync. This is my favorite one because I don't even need command line access to manipulate this, and we'll see what that looks like. I can literally set Lydia's account up within the native Windows 10 mail application and act as her. And we'll see that too. All right, so what does that look like? I'm going to play a video for this one because it's a little bit more involved, but the preamble to that is I have these accounts set up already within the mail app, but I'm going to show you with this video how simple it is now that I just have a username and a password. ActiveSync, the legacy protocol, is enabled, and I can bypass MFA to set their account, these accounts up here as an attacker on my own Windows 10 workstation. So here we go. So as you'll see, there's no Lydia here yet. So this is just me as an attacker setting up Lydia's account right now. Add account, advanced setup, as you'll see. Exchange ActiveSync, that protocol we talked about. Plug in their email address, their password, the domain, simple enough, not a lot of information I don't already have, very simple. I already have their password. The server is just outlook.office365.com. And then I can call the account anything I want. We'll call it Lydia's hacked account. Sign in, syncing, done. So now, as you can see, there's Lydia's inbox. I can now send email as Lydia. I can receive it. I can check their calendar, their phone book, all kinds of stuff as an attacker that I can use to keep going in the environment. Let's get out of this. Great. So that's ActiveSync. I had also mentioned Exchange Web Services. That's another protocol that I like to leverage, and that is active here on this account, right? EWS. That's a command line option that I have to use. So we're going to use another tool called Mail Sniper. What this does is it's another quote unquote hacking tool. Can be used by anybody, obviously, but for attackers, I can say, okay, no, that's MFA sweep, sorry. So this tool, Mail Sniper, has a lot of different modules, right? So it can download the address list from an organization. It can check user inboxes for data. It can do all kinds of stuff. One of the tools within this suite, so to speak, the Mail Sniper suite, is called Invoke Self-Search. So what that means is I can give this tool, that same server, outlook.office365.com, like you saw with the ActiveSync demo. The mailbox is Lydia's, right, that we have credentials for. This terms, this basically says, what am I searching for within this person's inbox if I get access to it? The 2 stars mean everything. Dash remote means that I am not on the local network. I'm doing this remotely. So there needs to be a session initiated back and forth. Check attachments means I want to download any attachments where it finds interesting terms. The download directory is my desktop, as in my attacker desktop, right? So I hit enter here. It asks me for Lydia's credentials again to initiate that remote connection. Just going to plug those in real quick. Hit OK. Using EWS URL here. That's the EWS endpoint to authenticate to, like this. Searching Lydia's mailbox for all terms, found an attachment called passwords.txt. And also, just in case, here are Lydia's tos and froms, the subject of the email, the body of the email, which my text is too big, or you'll be able to see parts of the body. But the more important thing here is that this thing automatically downloads that file. So if I go back to my desktop, here's that file, and I can just look at it as an attacker, right? That could be an XLS file, that could be a doc file, that could be pretty much anything that's there. It could be patient data. It's often patient data. It's often financial data. It's often internal data that you don't want people to know about, right? Here we've got access to third-party applications likely that are not hosted internally. So like medical record application, password for Lydia, the banking application, whatever it may be, right? And then we can pivot, get there if we want to. There we go. I had also mentioned earlier, one other thing I wanted to show when it comes to MFA bypass. I had mentioned that you could have users that have not yet set up MFA, right? And that an account like that can be taken over by an attacker because they have not been forced to set up MFA the first time they log in, right? So we're going to spray again. We're going to try a different password. We want more credentials, right? So we know Lydia, we know we can leverage Lydia for a lot, but let's go back and get more credentials, right? Let's do this again, different password. Give it a sec. Doing it again, and we found more. So now we have Adele's account. Adele's using weak password. Summer is here, exclamation point, right? So now we have those credentials. Now, I'll give it up now. Adele does not have MFA configured, but what does that look like? As an attacker, when I log in. So we'll go back to my Windows VM. We will use, that's being blocked. Okay, we're going to go to login.microsoft.com. Okay, so I have all these accounts, right? Adele, let's go to Adele's account. I've already done this, obviously. Enter password. So that's the password I copy pasted. Summer is here, right? Sign in. More information is required, okay? Next. Keep your account secure, enter phone number. As a hacker, I'm putting my hacker phone number in here, saying text me a code. I'm getting the code, I'm authenticating via that third factor, and now I'm Adele. And the organization is none the wiser, right? So now I'm Adele. Everybody thinks I'm Adele. I can send emails Adele. I can do whatever I want as Adele. Or if I'm an attacker and I don't want to go that far, like for instance, if I'm doing a pen test, I'm not going to set this up, obviously, if I find it, because that would be making a change to the environment. I'm just going to skip setup. Say sign in, sure, but no, not here. And there we go. I'm inside. I'm Adele. What does she have access to? Teams, all this good stuff over here, right? I'm going to log out as Adele for now because we have other demos coming later. Great. Okay. So now I've seen MFA bypass. Let's go back to the slides. Oops. There we go. Okay. So now I'm in the environment. I've bypassed MFA. I have a couple sets of credentials. What am I going to do now that I have some access, right? If you go back to that initial access, credential harvesting, all that good stuff, that slide before the MITRE attack one, post-compromise, what am I going to do now, right? So I'm now past your security boundary, right? I essentially have internal access. I can do all kinds of things, right? For the purposes of today, spread ransomware via malicious Word documents, Excel files. If I want to, right, I can say, hey, I'm Lydia. What's Lydia's job? Who knows, accounting, say. What I'm going to do is potentially send an Excel file, entice people to click on it, right? It has malware baked in that I've uploaded to their account, send it across the entire organization. And I'm willing to bet quite a few people click on it because as far as they know, I'm Lydia. They have no reason to believe I'm not. I'm past your security boundary at that point, right? I can also access Microsoft Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive, all those apps, right? Do you know what your employees are storing there? There's probably a lot of data being shared amongst people that shouldn't necessarily be being shared. Password files, like I mentioned, that you saw there, client data, patient data, you name it, happens all the time. I can download that data, right? Attachment files, all that good stuff. I can get access to third-party apps, like we saw in that password file for Lydia's account. Install persistence, right? Set up command and control, settle into the network, since I am past that security boundary. And how do you find that? Well, you have to have layered security, right? Not just a hard outer crust and a soft GUI center. You need to have, what we beat people over the head with all the time, defense in depth, right? So now we're going to go post-compromise demo. This is where, if anything's going to go hairy in my demos, it's going to be here. So now, like I said, we're past the security boundary. We can bypass MFA, we can log into accounts, we can set up MFA if we want to, right? We kind of have a run of the environment at this point. So let's spread some ransomware. So I'm going to go back to my VM. We're going to go back to the mail app, right? So I have Lydia's account, okay? As I said, I can now spread malware, if I want to, as Lydia, to the rest of the organization. What does that look like, right? Now at this point, it's going to get slightly confusing because I'm using this at the same time as both an attack machine and a user endpoint, right? So Lydia's account, I'm acting as Lydia. I'm going to send an email called party invite. It's a doc file, right? It's a docx file, right? Sometimes malware has like docm or it has other weird extensions, meaning macros are enabled. And I'll explain what macros are in a second. But this is pretty innocuous looking, right? There's an X at the end. It's just like everybody who's not clicking on that, right? It's party invite. It's from Joni. We think it's from Joni, right? It's internal. We'd love it for you to make it to my ransomware party. Invites attached. Please open an RSVP, right? I'm going to send that to Joni, who's another user inside my environment, right? So I'm going to send this off to Joni. Sent. Now we're going to go to Joni's account, which is also hacked. And now we're acting as Joni, right? That's why it's a little bit confusing, but now we're acting as Joni in the same workspace. We're going to give it a sec. There's the invite from Lydia, sent through Lydia by an attacker, right? Reading this, cool. Oh, there's a party, great. Let me save this to my desktop. Sure. Open it up. Oh no, that's not supposed to happen. Enable editing, right? People click through that ransomware button or the ransomware button. Oops. People tend to click through that button that I clicked up here at the top, which says enable editing or whatever it is it said, right? I do it all the time. I'm guilty when I get internal emails that have some type of macro or something in them, potentially created by accounting or whoever it may be. Point being, people will click through it and then that malware thing fires and then it's like, oh no, right? Now in reality, it's not going to probably look like that. It's not just gonna, you're going to send this out and everybody's going to know there's malware, right? It's going to run that macro in the background, which is basically, I should have explained this, basically a small code snippet that can perform commands on the operating system underneath, right? So what that did was just popped up a little thing that said malware detected, right? But that it fires in a similar way where you're not going to necessarily see what happens on the back end, but it's potentially going to give that attacker remote access to your system, right? And then they can move around laterally in the environment, right? So the more people that open that and give that attacker remote access, the more access they're going to have to the environment, right? And some of those are likely, since it's coming again from an internal user, some of those people may have admin rights, which they can then use to take over domain controllers, right? And other systems of interest, really see what's going on in the environment, suck out some data, right? And then encrypt the rest. And then that's where you get your ransomware pop up. So that was just for effect, but I think you get the idea. Great. So what else can I do, right? So now I can do not only ransomware attacks and things like that, but I mean, I can just go right to the data. So for what does that look like, right? So let's go back to my web browser. Log back in as, let's log in as Lydia again. Spoiler alert, she doesn't have MFA either. Just gonna blow through this real quick. Sure. So again, here we go. So, okay, what's in here? We got passwords again. We got, oh, social security numbers. It's gonna make me sign in again, but you get the point. Yeah, passwords. I can access some of these things over here. So Teams, for instance, right? Okay, skip this again. Use the web app. And now I'm in as Lydia. to Teams, right? So as Lydia, looks like Lydia has sent a reminder on Teams to go visit the ransomware, to check the ransomware invite. And Joni's opened it and now we have problems, right? So point being, I can see internal Teams communication. I can send messages to Lydia again, just like emails, right? A lot of people will attach files here. So if there are any files, right, I'd have access to those. I could read that stuff, whatever I want to do. Cool. What else? I can look through OneDrive. Yeah. Client data. Cool. Passwords. What's in client data? Those are the social security numbers. There's nothing in here, but just for effect. So I can see that stuff. We see this all the time too, right? Where we get access to one app, we get access to all apps, and then we can see all this stuff. We'll take screenshots, we'll redact to prove a point, right? And then there's recommendations involved with that after the fact. So that is the long and short of the demo. Now, we're not going to leave you without recommendations. So what can you do? We're going super fast on time here. I thought that would take longer. So user awareness, right? Think before clicking. Are there misspellings in an email that comes in that's not typical, right? Grammar issues. Who's that email coming from, right? Is it an email that would typically come from that person? Is it a third party? Is it outside the organization, right? There's even more hairs raised on the back of your neck when you see something fishy coming from someone who doesn't even work there. Do you typically receive this type of email, right? Is it something you would expect? You can hover over links if there's a link in an email, right? Where does it actually go, right? Does it go to like hackerwebsite.com, or does it, whereas it says in the link that it goes to Microsoft, things like that. Oftentimes, and we'll do this as well, whether it's emails, phone calls, whatever it may be, we'll say, you know, you have to do this thing as fast as possible, right? Or you have to, you're going to lose out on something if you don't act now. Or, you know, when we do phone calls, when we're doing this type of thing, we'll say, you know, let's say we're calling somebody as information, the IT team, right? We'll say, hey, we're pretty sure, you know, your account's been hacked. We need to go through some checks with you to see if that's accurate, you know, blah, 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 blah. We'll get in that way. So it's playing on emotions. So if something's playing on emotions and it seems out of sorts, I would also be worried about it. Incentivize good behavior. Oops. So
I would add, Joe, just to give some more depth to how attackers will do spear phishing, and we've certainly done these type of projects where we're going to the CFO's LinkedIn page and using other vectors to really craft a specific story that's going to resonate with that CFO. So we might find that the CFO is the grand poobah of the Elks organization in Chicago. And now we're going to use that to help craft an email that we're, you know, a grand poobah from the Elks in Minnesota. And now we're going to, you know, use that information that's really going to resonate, you know, with the subject of the attack, you know, the attack, say, you know, to not raise any alarms. Like, this has to be right, because they really know detailed information, and people don't realize how detailed a LinkedIn profile or a Facebook, you know, account, you know, can aid attackers in really crafting that specific story to kind of get through kind of logical defenses.
sure, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, we see, I mean, there are times where I'm having to, you know, go through and look at LinkedIn accounts, and if I'm trying to craft a phishing message, or if I'm making, you know, we call vishing, which is basically phishing but via phone. we'll be looking through LinkedIn, we'll be looking at, different people we might be able to target, right? And what types of technology they're using in their environment, right? What kinds of databases. And what we'll do is say, okay, who worked in IT at this place? Go look at their profile. Very often, people have their entire resumes posted to LinkedIn that anybody can just look at, right? And then, okay, I worked from here to here, wherever, for how long. I'm currently at this employer. Here are all the technologies that I am good with, right? So it'd be like, they'll just list off like everything that's being used in the environment, right? They'll talk about firewalls, they'll talk about Mimecast if they're using stuff like that, right? So it's a really good way to craft a ruse before you actually go in for the kill.
The other thing to note too is having a pretty tight policy that someone cannot use their network credentials as their LinkedIn username and password. And Joe, you would know more. I mean, the LinkedIn hack, the big one, happened several years ago, and we still use it. That list of hacked email and passwords. So making sure that people's social media accounts do not mimic the username and password for their corporate credentials is really a key policy to implement.
I mean, on top of that, a key policy is none of your users, and this is a very good use case, should be using their work email anywhere except for work. There are websites called, for instance, dhashed.com. You can pay $5 a week as anybody. Go on there, search for so-and-so Lydia on Microsoft.com and see if that username, meaning that email address, and the associated credential has been in a breach somewhere. And it'll tell you if it was LinkedIn, if it was, Walmart, Target, wherever that breach came from, what the credential was at the time, oftentimes in plain text. And then you can, okay, well, that happened, I don't know, a year ago. I know where this person works now. Maybe I can try password combinations that are similar to that one. It's probably not gonna be the same password, but it might be close, right? So definitely people should not be using their corporate accounts for signing up to Yahoo or their bank or whatever else. So incentivizing good behavior. Create simple ways for users to report phishing emails, for instance, right? So is there a button in Outlook they can push that auto forwards to an address that IT monitors? Is there a specific, if you don't have that, is there an email address that people know about that they can use to forward the phishing email to, right? Basically, make it as easy as possible for end users to deal with a potential phish effectively before it can cause damage, right? Reward employees, right? So part of internal phishing training could be, let's say you run internal phishing quarterly or every 6 months or whatever it may be. People that report, or the first 10 people to report, maybe they get a gift card to something, right? Or they're called out in a staff meeting as doing the right thing, something like that, right?
I would add, Joe, these type of activities speak to the fact of actually building a real security awareness program versus a checkbox, new hire onboarding, never to be kind of mentioned again. So, I always say, hey, I've worked with a lot of hospitals in my career, building out these type of programs, and things like putting up posters and, little laminated mounts on the cafeteria tables, and publishing, the helpline, and just communicating and get into the environment. As a security officer or security professional, do some walkthroughs, speak to the folks, in the organization, see what, is tripping them up, and have those real conversations of getting that kind of awareness campaign, stood up. And it's continual. It's training, testing, And that's the only way you're going to see that those phishing response numbers go down into the single digits and get below 5%. We want to, like Joe mentioned, you want to see zero, but certainly, from a realistic standpoint, you want to get to that 1 to 2%. And now it's a manageable number where you can go out and talk to Lydia or someone who's continually, clicking on those emails and have that, more formal discussion.
Right. Yeah, 100%. And as Mike was just saying, this last kind of point here, don't solely focus on click rate, focus on reporting, right? The other side of that coin of, reward employees who report or catch such emails is don't lambast the employees who report or who click, right? Use it as a training exercise, right? Understandable if you have, habitual clickers that time and time and time again, right? That's a different conversation, but it should not be a culture of fear if somebody does the wrong thing. They shouldn't be afraid to fess up to the fact that they made a mistake, right? Okay. Remote access security. So I think my main takeaway on this slide is I showed just one method of how an attacker can get into an environment. The Colonial Pipeline attack that just happened, the massive ransomware attack that just happened. Someone, I believe it was a VPN. It was a VPN connection that was not configured with MFA for an old account. That was their tiny little main entry point, and that's how they got access to the rest of the environment and caused the damage they caused, right? So again, no MFA, but that was via VPN, right? We used O365 as an example. There's also remote desktop. If you are exposing RDP, remote desktop, to the world, and you're not monitoring it vigorously, I mean, arguably it's not the best idea to have it exposed, but if you have no other method of having remote workers get into the environment, right? That needs to be highly monitored for brute force password attacks. Brute force meaning just throwing a ton of passwords at something, seeing what sticks, as opposed to password spraying, which is low and slow that I showed, right? Go to my PC, right? Citrix. There are times we've gotten into Citrix environments because they weren't properly configured with MFA. And any other product, right? Know what's out there and people are using, right? That old VPN you forgot about doesn't have MFA configured on it. That can be an entry point. Anything that you forgot about, we're going to find. Not 100% of it, but often enough of it that it's going to cause you problems if you don't know what's out there. That comes down to asset management, right? Like, do you know what you own? It's a very, very simple concept. It's not easy to do in practice, but it's important. So remote access security, right? Once you know what's on your perimeter, once you know what you're exposing to the world, what can you do to lock it down, right? So we talked about enforcing MFA for all users. And when I say all users, I mean all users, right? Your C-suite or the brother of the owner of the company who's breathing down your neck because he doesn't want to have MFA, do everything you can to not give into that, because oftentimes they're going to be targeted first. When we do phishing engagements, almost every single time we are told to leave X, Y, or Z person out of the test because for whatever reason, right? Obviously there's pressure there, right? You don't want to annoy the boss. You don't want to annoy the boss's boss, things like that. But doing everything you can, and it starts at the top, like fostering that culture of, this applies to all of us because we can all be had, so to speak, by an attacker is very important. As I said numerous times, conditional access policies, right? These things can be configured for so many different use cases, right? You can block logins or require additional security measures for a login that's outside of a geographical location where your users typically would not be accessing your environment. So if you're located in Ohio and someone's trying to access the environment from California, they're going to have to go through more security measures in order to get access, or they're just not going to be allowed to get access, depending upon how you configure your conditional access, right? As I said, you can block legacy authentication with conditional access, right? It can be tricky, but it can be done. There are guides out there that Microsoft has that can help you do this. You can force, I guess I just said, enforce MFA for all users. I think that if you're using security defaults, I could be wrong about this, but it only requires MFA for your administrative users. I could triple check that, but point being, ensure MFA for everyone possible, right? There are times where we've been on assessments where we got one user's account, and then with that user's account, we downloaded the entire, what they call the global address list for the environment. So that has usernames, it has service accounts, right? All that good stuff in there. And the service account, for whatever reason, access to O365, and we could log in as the service account and see the internals. We could see inboxes and things like that, and then enumerate from there, right? Because they left the service accounts out of this process. There are better ways to do that. I'm certainly not a Microsoft administrator, but not a good thing. And block, here's a biggie that I showed you, block MFA registration from untrusted locations, right? So again, if I have not set up MFA yet, but I'm required to, and I'm going to do it, right? What I just did here, let's say that organization, the fake organization, is located in California, and I'm trying to set up MFA from Boston. It's gonna, you can't do that, right? It's not gonna let me take that account over.
One thing I would add, Joe, and again, from my healthcare experience, doing something like a firewall rule-based review, and there's a lot of tools you can use to do that, to identify any ports that have been opened for vendors. A port could have been opened 5 years ago for GE or some other hardware manufacturer to log in to a remote device to do a firmware upgrade. We consistently see that those ports have never been shut down. And certainly that is going to introduce more risk from a remote access standpoint into the organization.
Right. And so this slide kind of focuses on, obviously, Microsoft, because if you weren't already in the cloud in the last 15 months, you're certainly there now. And it's more than likely going to be Microsoft. So I'm pointing these out primarily because this is what I see time and time again as being entry points to our clients. It's getting better. People are seeing that risk and dealing with it. But it is still out there, and it is still a big problem. But this applies, again, to remote access, RDP, VPNs, you name it. Any of your endpoints, they need to be locked down and configured appropriately. Okay. Again, so again, MFA should be required. Conditional access policies, passwords and PINs should still be strong, even if combination with other factors, depending upon. So I know, like, for instance, Citrix, I believe it's Citrix, has like an MFA code, but then there's a PIN that's assigned to the end of it. And there's like all these different authentication methods. I can't remember how it works, but those PINs need to be secure. Again, I think I already brought this up on the last slide, but don't allow executives to forego MFA or other security controls. There was a pretty big client about a year, I don't even know how long ago, but we were doing password spraying against their Citrix environment. And their Citrix was a little bit older. It wasn't the most recent version of the deployment. And we were password spraying it. And accounts weren't getting locked out. And we're like, okay, well, we'll just keep going. Sooner or later, we guess credentials. And it's literally like the name of the organization, the year and an exclamation point. And it was like 3 users. So then I look up, I'm like, okay, who are these people on LinkedIn? And one of them is the head of security for the organization. And that was his password, right? And then we logged in as him to Office 365, no multi-factor, right? So I have no idea what was going on there, but head of security, he would think would impose upon himself multi-factor authentication and have a better password, but you never know. Weirder things have happened, obviously. endpoint security controls, right? So let's say, and this goes back to defense in depth, right? If they get past your boundary, right? If the password's break, gets a password. If for some strange reason, legacy authentication and your conditional access policies are out of whack and they are able to use what I showed to get in and then potentially spread malware, get data, et cetera, et cetera. If they, when they're spreading that ransomware, right? Is it going to be detected by an endpoint, right? Like, are you going to see it happening? Like you're trying to catch it at every step along that. And I hate to say it, kill chain, right? You're trying to catch it anywhere you can to stop it, stop the bleeding. So just because it doesn't sound like it's related, it is related. Like you need things that are gonna see what's going on endpoints on your servers, like throughout the environment. Say again, signature-based detection alone isn't enough. If you can afford it, highly recommend what they call heuristic detection or like behavioral-based detections. So it's not just looking at, have I seen this malware before? Or have I seen this piece of code before? Is it bad? Yes or no? Okay, I've never seen it, must be fine, let it go. What you need is, sure, that, but also, what is it doing, right? What is it trying to access on that endpoint? Is it trying to dump parts of memory that contain passwords? Is it trying to enumerate certain parts? Is it trying to change registry keys? Like, what is it doing on the endpoint? And then make a decision if it's a problem based on that as well, right? So that's a big one. Extend asset patch vulnerability management processes, all of your processes, all of the things, right? If it's a toaster in your environment with an IP address, it counts and it should be in your asset inventory. Okay, not us, but there was I don't know if it was a conference talk or what it was that I watched relatively recently, where the security company literally got in through a IP toaster that was in the lunchroom. And it had like its password was whatever the default password was. They got into it. It was obviously running some type of a Linux kernel, I think. They were able to get into that thing and then move laterally in the environment, right? So even the little things count, right? Your IP cameras, your printers. There's at least at this point within the last, year, 3 or 4 different establishments where there was a default password set on a printer because a vendor had come in, done some work, hard rebooted it, and it went back to default. We caught that, got into the printer. We're then able to suck out service account credentials from that printer. And now we're on the domain and can do a lot of other things, enumerate shares, escalate privileges, things like that. So asset management is huge.
I would also mention, these are great exercises that one can inform your incident response plan, or you can run in concert, which would be referred to as a kind of a purple team exercise, or really building it. You want to right size, and these type of engagements can be right sized to the size and complexity of the organization. But oftentimes we're doing this type of testing and at the same time judging the incident response plan. One, are the tools working as intended? And 2, what is your CERT team's response, or those folks that you've identified, to be called into action when a real incident happens, and kind of judging that response. Once that lateral movement's detected, who gets called and what process and procedures are being implemented to either stop or mitigate the risk of what's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I would also say, if you're or even if you're not a smaller organization and you are contracting with a third party to pay attention to certain parts of your network, it is incumbent upon you to know what you're paying for and to know what they're supposed to be doing for you. And on top of that, it's incumbent upon you to make sure you're providing them with the data flow, right, and the access they need to properly monitor your environment. So obviously that gets a little tricky if they want, certain types of credentials that seem like they would give them access to everything. Oftentimes service accounts for tools don't necessarily need to be domain administrator. It's just that the company that you're contracting with has found that that's the easiest, laziest solution. And they're just going to say, give me a DA account to run everything on. probably not necessary most of the time. But back to my main point, know what you're paying for, know what you're getting, right? Know that, for instance, if you're paying them X amount a year to monitor your endpoints. Like if that's what the contract language says, like, okay, well, anything can be an endpoint. Which endpoints? How many of those endpoints? Where are you going to aggregate log data from, right? Is it just servers? Is it workstations and servers? Is it a subset of, some area of the network? And then obviously, what are you going to be alerted to and how are you going to be alerted to it? That password spraying attack, why is that a medium, right? Why isn't somebody picking up the phone and telling you that someone is actively password spraying your environment so that you know about it and letting you know the steps involved to handle that? All of these things, right? I like to say it's a partnership. It's not just like you're paying for a loaf of bread and walking out of the store and you're never talking to that person again, right? Like there needs to be a back and forth with your team to make sure that these things are being done and configured appropriately.
We've met some very sharp third parties that usually are involved in these type of exercises when we're dealing with clients that use those. And we've met some really good managed service providers in the security space, but we've also had some uncomfortable conversations, during these engagements as to why didn't you pick this up? Why were we allowed to do this? And again, to Joe's point, it's really going to help either solidify that relationship with that vendor, or maybe cause you to investigate alternatives, to that relationship.
Yeah, sometimes that ends up being, on a job that comes down to root causes. They didn't necessarily know what they didn't know was being monitored or what wasn't being monitored, and that's why they missed things. And that's how an attacker could have gone in unnoticed for 3 to 5 months and sniffed around, and then when they were ready, deployed their ransomware, right? Database backup and security and backup security. Strong credentials, obviously, there are oftentimes we're on an assessment where the database administrator password is default. We can get into the database and that's game over, right? All client data, patient data, whatever it may be. God forbid you are hit with ransomware, 3-2-1 rule, right? 3 copies of data, one's your primary, you've got 2 backups, they're being stored in different medias, and 1 copy is stored offsite that is not networked, right? So 3-2-1 rule, I think most people have probably heard of that. I'm not going to dwell on it. And we have some additional resources for you. We're coming to the end. So I want to talk about this a little bit. So CIS, Center for Internet Security, has benchmarks for so many things. I highly recommend the 365 Foundations benchmark, because that will basically tell you, okay, they have different levels. They have like level 1, level 2, and it depends on the environment and like what subscription you've paid for, right? So if you have like E5, or some things are, a lot of our clients don't have E5. It's very expensive to have that level. Some of those controls only apply if you have certain types of product, right? But basically, it gives you the foundations, and it'll say, oh, like password things, legacy authentication things, just general best practices that you can kind of go through and kind of check off and then work your way through that list to harden your boundary. MITRE ATT&CK framework I brought up, again, very good resource. I don't know if we're sharing this slide deck or not, but there are links to all these things in the slide deck. These are all links you can just click on and go to those places if you trust us. More links to Microsoft recommendations for how to plan conditional access deployment, right? I said conditional access is not necessarily easy to configure. This can help you start to go down that road if you're not necessarily using it that much right now and you want to get into it. What is conditional access in the first place and how does it work? This is huge, the Verizon data breach investigations report. The 2021 came out, I want to say like 2-3 weeks ago. From what I recall, not a ton of surprises there. Ransomware is a huge problem for financial healthcare, obviously manufacturing, pretty much everyone at the moment. And it's always the same ways in, right? It's people, missing controls, phishing, right? Social engineering attacks, bad passwords, all that good stuff. US cert, I think this one snuck in on me, but data backup options, I'm not gonna lie, I haven't read that link. We have our own insights on our website, right? We have a lot of stuff up there. I have one here. Mike's got a couple. We have other partners that have written a lot of good things about security frameworks, how to follow them, how to get on board with them, how to pick one, right? Guarding against phishing attacks, malware attacks, things you can do to harden your environments, securing the cloud, right? Lots of good resources on our website. And with that, we are at question time if Mike does not have anything else he'd like to add.
So I was just going to kind of put a bow on it, as they say, and wanted to let folks know that certainly, hopefully you got some good, you kind of got that under the tent view of what an actual attacker, the techniques and methodologies that they use, certainly things that to be aware of. And like Joe mentioned before, we really just, I don't even know if we hit the tip of the iceberg. There's just multiple points of entry and egress, multiple vectors that attackers are looking at. We took a small snippet on O365 and showing you an attack vector and the methodology behind escalating privileges to install malware or specifically ransomware. So hopefully, you'll be able to use things to go back and again, make some improvements. I will say, and Wolf & Company in general is not a hard sales organization, but if there's anyone on the current webinar, we certainly would afford you the opportunity. You can reach out to me directly if you have any other questions, or if you'd like to set up, a 60-minute session to walk through your environment, maybe kind of have us eyeball, what you're doing, your methodology around penetration testing. Certainly, if anyone's interested in doing a scoping exercise, we would be certainly open to that. And get you some more detailed information, what an actual project from Wolf & Company would look like. But with that, I just thank everyone for their attendance, and certainly Stephanie, I would now throw it to you in terms of what questions may have been asked.
Thanks, Mike. So I just want to let the audience know we will be sharing the slide deck and the recording. Everybody who attended the webinar will receive that to the email that they've registered for the webinar. So the slide deck will include those links that Joe had mentioned towards the end. So we'll get right into questions. I hope everyone can stay to join us. The first question we received: why do you think employees working remotely are more prone to clicking on phishing emails?
Mike, you want to take that one or want me to take it?
I would say, I think, and I don't want to speak for you, Joe, but I think when you were mentioning that, I think the main takeaway was that almost the time it takes for the alerting, if someone's remote, or, there just isn't, there's more of those kind of walls that have been set up in the time of kind of alerting to a possible phishing attack, maybe lengthened in a remote environment versus more of a traditional office setup where someone can raise their hand or alert folks right away to a possible phishing attack.
Yeah, exactly. And also, let's be honest, and it doesn't mean they're lazy. People aren't just sitting there at their desk 8 hours a day and staring at their inbox, right? So people might be going out for lunch. People are going for a run at 2:30, whatever. That fish goes out there, it's just sitting in inboxes. Nobody said anything about it. They haven't seen it yet, right? So less opportunity for, eyes on to report as quickly as possible.
And I'll throw I'll use myself as an example, and I don't know if this will resonate with folks. Certainly since the pandemic has started, my calendar is double booked, triple booked, and the speed of which you're performing tasks, at least I've seen some sloppiness creep in to my day-to-day activities as I'm trying to send a million emails, and I hope not too many wolf folks are on the line, but if I'm in a meeting and now I have to send out a quick, a couple emails, just things are moving at a quicker pace. At least that's been my experience. And certainly that speed can lend itself to kind of a making mistakes, I think, is just a simple way to put it. You're moving fast, and now traditionally, you're going to hover over the actual email address to see what that, where it's actually pointing to. Those things can, at least that's what I've seen from going to a more remote environment. Just the people's days are more packed, and there's more opportunities for making mistakes.
Great, thank you both. The next question is, how secure is Duo security for VPN MFA?
So I think with every solution, it depends on how it's configured and how it's deployed. I will say, and I don't, some things that are interesting with Duo or some of the other ones, like if we're on an engagement where we guess a set of credentials and they're using a tool like that, there's the option to just, let's say they get an automatic alert, like, okay, so you signed in, right, using those credentials, and then there's an automatic alert generated on that person's phone that says, did you just sign in? Or, click yes or no, right? And a lot of times, like Mike said, people are moving quickly and they just hit yes, right? It's happened before where, we've run into that. And we're like, oh no, we just alerted them to something's going on. We didn't mean to. And then within 10 seconds, we're brought into the internal, the office page or whatever it may be, because the person is in the middle of their day and just hit yes. Something I did trigger this, whatever, hit yes. We could debate ease of user access compared to security. I think there are better ways to implement those controls where you are forced to pay attention to what's going on. So like, okay, you have to actually complete some type of there's a pin that has to be entered, or there's a, whatever it may be, right? So, I mean, they're good controls to have. I don't tend to say like, oh, use this one over that one. It's just, I think it's all a matter of how you deploy it and how you configure it and how you test it, especially before it goes out the door to your users.
Great, thanks, Joe. The next question on deck is, if you had to pick one control to protect us from ransomware, what would that be?
Replace all users with robots. I mean, no offense to users, but I mean, that's still ultimately the biggest problem, right? Is if somebody, lets you in the front door and then there's a control in place that doesn't work, yada, 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 right? Like there is no, and I know maybe it feels like I'm dodging the question a little bit, but there is no one control that I'm going to say you should lean on necessarily for security. It's a defense in depth approach, right? It's user training. It's conditional access policies. It's making sure MFA is configured when it's supposed to be configured for every account. It's separation of privilege, right? So as few people have rights that they need as possible to get their job done, and that's it, right? Sally in accounting probably doesn't need to have domain admin access, right? It doesn't really make much sense. Things like that. There's endpoint detection. There's intrusion detection and prevention systems to monitor traffic that are going north, south, east, west, whatever. There are ways to stop certain types of traffic using those controls. There's the endpoints, right? Like we said, and again, I'm not advocating for any like CrowdStrike, Carbon Black, whatever it may be, that are, if you get this far and you're going to try to fire something, I'm going to catch you, right? So it's layered. There's really no one-stop shop. don't know if Mike has anything else to add to that or not, but
I concur.
Awesome. Does a Wolf offer pen test for our third parties in order for us to properly risk assess the technologies that we use?
that's my question.
Yes. And again, it's going to be, it kind of depends, in terms of, for any type of penetration test or threat emulation attack or doing vendor risk assessment work, we do a lot of merger and acquisition type of risk assessments where our core client is now purchasing another organization, and they want to do a security risk assessment before they actually integrate that network into their, or give that network access to the core network. So it's really kind of talking through what you want to accomplish, but the simple answer is yes.
Awesome. Our next question, our executives will sometimes ask if the hacker can bypass MFA, what's the point of using MFA? Many of our clients are elderly and are not the best at accessing their tax information or portals and encrypted emails and etc. So how does MFA benefit here?
So I understand the frustration around it. MFA is just another layered control, right? So for like 2 questions ago, they said, kind of like, what's the main thing you would point out as a control that can, save us? It's another layer of security, right? I would say that, yes, it's the never ending debate of how easy are we going to make our users' lives compared to our own security and protecting our own necks as an organization, right? So it's up to the organization to determine that risk and say, if we need certain people to only be able to access certain things that we don't consider high risk, then maybe we can allow them to go without X, Y, or Z control. But that doesn't mean that you just hit the easy button and then remove that control from everyone, because it's easier to do it that way, right? It's privileged access, separation of privilege, like I mentioned before. I'm not going to try to pretend I have the answer to those who are not so technically inclined. That is more of I don't have a lot of research in that area. I mean, maybe if Mike has anything else he can add, but I don't know what the solution to that issue is. I mean, as a security tester, someone coming from quote unquote the red side and seeing the damage it can do when those controls are not in place, I am prone to say, I'm sorry, but you just got to figure it out, because the damage outweighs.
I think that's the response. And certainly, it go back 5 years and then there's always been something. I mean, I remember the arguments of, well, our internal users love to use, external drives, or, a memory stick to save, a USB drive to save information. There is no business case that I've ever seen that makes sense for allowing a non-encrypted USB drive to be used on a network. So it's that pushback of, there's been a paradigm shift. And I understand that sometimes these can be frustrating, but as an organization, we have to implement these controls. I mean, I've been using 14-character complex passwords going on 20 years now. It's doable. And it's getting out in front of it. Certainly, I am not thumbing my nose to the political environment in any organization. And certainly those conversations from the top down, that's why it's important that security has a seat at the table, that it's the security officer, is a C-level person that has a seat and, is going to be doing board reporting or reporting up to an overall risk committee, and making that argument that these controls are necessary. and understanding that you are going to get some pushback and you're going to have some messaging as that pushback comes in. But having MFA at this point, and in 2021, that's a minimum control that needs, that's a minimum control that needs to just be implemented, no matter what the pushback is.
Thanks, Mike. What tools do you recommend for ransomware checking removal? And are they continuously updated?
That is a very good question on like specific tool. Like, so essentially, we don't know if it's there, but we want to see if it is, right? Depending upon the size of your organization, that might be, depending on how bad the situation is, you're probably going to want to call in third-party help, or if you happen to have that function inbuilt in your organization, those folks would know what to do on the incident response team, right? I'm not going to say that I am aware of any that I personally know that I trust that would do that, like for an incident response team, as opposed to just one person in IT being like, I think I'll run this and see what happens. I don't know if that's necessarily the scope of the question, but I can get back to you on that. If Steph,
yeah, for sure.
Your details.
What is Wolf's approach on zero trust infrastructure?
Wow. Mike, anything there? You want me to take it?
You can start.
So essentially, nobody has any access that they don't need to anything. They have exactly what they're required to have, right? To do their job, nothing more, maybe less, nothing more. That's it. Easier said than done. That's how I view it. Again, Susie in accounting shouldn't have DA. If there's a file share, right? You've got, 10 people with shared file folders, like user folders on a file share. Why do I have access to everybody else's? Why can they see mine, right? Why can they do some specific function outside of accounting that they probably don't necessarily need to be able to do? It just makes their life easier, so that's why they have it, right? You shouldn't be trying, and that goes beyond people. It's systems, it's infrastructure. Like, things should not have access, and they should not be trusted, right? For any more than there is absolutely like business critical functionality. Mike, anything?
Yeah, so from an internal perspective, what we always consistently try to drive our clients to is role-based access. And sometimes it's easier said than done, but based on someone's role, you're developing a template of what they have access to. So an admin has access to these systems, a business line manager will have access to these systems. And now you're really segmenting internal access by role, which is much more manageable than the kind of like as scenario that we see all the time. Joey is similar to Susie. So now we're going to provision Joey for what we provision for Susie. Especially kind of in healthcare and some more complex environments where you're looking at hundreds of systems that contain PII. So, developing that and and you're doing it incrementally. And again, you're only giving access to what folks need to have access to. Externally, I think, Joe, having that zero trust is fairly easy to configure, through the firewall rules. And certainly, in our vendor risk assessments, we preach that, doing detailed vendor risk assessments, first cataloging who the vendors are, and then risk rating them high, moderate, and low, because that's where we see access creep. A lot of times is through vendors that have access to the network. And certainly I would, from a zero trust perspective, although sometimes you get close with a vendor, I think it's safer to err on the side of zero trust versus, something in the middle.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Joe, what are your thoughts on the productivity tracking software Terramind, and is it safe to have an information security standpoint?
I'm honestly not familiar with Terramind. Unfortunately, I've never tested it. I've never run into it. Is the question, how secure is it as a platform?
Your thoughts on the productivity tracking of that the software does?
Yeah, I've never, I'm sorry, I've never messed with it. I don't know it.
Not a problem.
Next. Stephanie, just to follow up on the zero trust question, one of our other wolfies on the call kind of IM me, and just mentioning that, looking at, software defined perimeter, towards a zero trust environment where there are no more firewalls, kind of lower use of credentials is another way, you can look at that issue.
Great. Next question is, what tools or tool sets do you recommend for ransomware checker removal? I think we actually already touched on this, and are they continuously updated? I'm going to move. I'm going to move to the next one. Just going through some of these questions. Some of them we've repeated. Some of you sent in a lot of the similar questions that have already been asked.
We'll answer Mr. Robert Leo's question offline.
For any small businesses today, what would you consider to be the bare minimum controls to deploy before undertaking a managed IT cybersecurity provider?
Can you read that one again?
Yeah. For any small businesses today, what would you consider to be the bare minimum controls to deploy before undertaking a managed IT cybersecurity provider?
I would answer it that there isn't a bare. I would say start having those discussions right away. I don't think there is. Getting help sooner rather than later, even if the maturity of your environment, the answer is most of those type of organizations are going to have some sort of infrastructure as a service, so they can actually help you address, what you're worried about in terms of the bare minimum controls. There are some very good managed service providers out there that have multiple lines of service where they can help from an infrastructure as a service. They can help deploying patches and updating firewalls to more advanced security managed service providers that are going to have managed SIMs, which is a security incident event management system, which is going to, aggregate those logs from multiple systems, and they'll be able to alert you to suspicious activity. So I think I would say don't be afraid of making that phone call to an organization to start those conversations.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. Next is, are there methods through which hackers can circumvent conditional access, trusted networks only, if they haven't compromised the network yet?
So essentially, I'm going to guess the question means they don't have credentials and then still somehow get past conditional access. I've seen personally no way of doing that. You need the credentials first. So for instance, like that tool that I showed called MFA sweep that checks for multi-factor, you can't do that unless you have an account to test that with, right? So like, how is that account set up, and therefore probably a lot of the rest of the environment set up? I need some type of an initial entry point before I'm gonna be able to see that information. That's not to say there are not super duper crazy advanced like nation state level ways around that, but I'm not aware of them personally.
That's good to hear. The next question is it better to have
Actually, I
endpoints?
want to say one more thing about that.
Oh, yeah.
You can get around certain things like that if there's some type of actual like binary exploit. Like if a VPN, like people like Pulse Secure, Fortinet, some of those have been in the news somewhat recently of having what they call like remote access, remote code execution vulnerabilities, where there are exploits in the wild that hackers are using to bypass their perimeter, not with credentials, but with literally an exploit like you see in the movies, where they're getting command line access to that firewall and then can pivot internally. That certainly bypasses, I mean, that bypasses Microsoft anything, generally speaking. I mean, you're not even touching conditional access, like you're in at that point. So pending those types of things, actual full-blown exploits, which we rarely, if ever, even have to use these days to get in, yes, it's possible. Sorry, I cut you off.
No, thanks, Joe. Thank you for providing some more insight. So we are running up on time. We have about 5 minutes left, so we'll probably get to one or two more questions. Next is it better to have endpoint detection or prevention or both?
I would say, again, it comes down to tuning, right? So it's like, if you're detecting and you're not preventing, well, then you better be good at detecting so that you can jump on it when something bad happens. Whereas if you have prevention and it's overly preventative, you're going to block network traffic that's supposed to get through and cause downtime maybe. So I think it's kind of, you got to weigh it. I mean, from an attacker perspective, I mean, it's probably going to be easier for me to get around detection only, because if you're not paying attention, then, or if I'm masking that traffic well, it's going to get right past. Whereas again, the IPS is going to stop some attacks and then tell you about it. It's not going to tell you and then hope that you're paying attention, right? And with the detection, it's, you know, is your, like, let's say you have a third party, you don't have an in-house security operations center that's watching this thing. Is your third party gonna, how are they, again, it goes back to like when you're getting password sprayed to Microsoft or on a VPN or whatever it may be, what are they paying attention to? How high do they classify the alert when it's happening, you know? So there's use cases for both. I'm not sure about pricing. My general sense is obviously that prevention is going to be more expensive. So there's that, right? And a lot of these security providers will provide this functionality when they deploy devices in your environment to collect logs and sniff traffic and whatever they're going to do, right? So and it comes down to price as well. There's a lot of factors in there.
Great, thanks, Joe. And I'm going to end with this question. How concerned should I be about jackware, ransomware for devices, for IoT devices?
So aside from like printers, I have never been the guy that took over the IP toaster and like deployed malware on it or anything like that, right? Like usually there's enough for me to mess with within the Windows environment or the Linux environment, like not like things running Linux on the back end, like an IP toaster or something like that. But there's enough for me to use that I don't need to mess with that personally. I don't think that high on your priority list should be figuring out how to make sure nobody takes over your IP toaster. I would just, make sure that it's updated on a regular basis. Like if it has updates that come out from the manufacturer, right? Make sure that if there's some type of a weird web-based console that you can then change settings on your IP toaster, that default password has changed, right? Hardening, things like that. I do not have stats for jackware. Honestly, I don't know how prevalent it is, how often it's used to get into places and cause problems. I don't remember seeing mention of it anywhere in the database or the Verizon report as like a major factor. So I would not put it high on a priority list, but I would make sure you're hardening the best you can.
Great, thanks, Joe. So with that, we're going to close down the webinar. I just want to thank everybody for taking time today to join us for 2 hours on the topic of ransomware. Like I said, We will be sending out the presentation and a recording, a link to the recording for you to view, for you to pass along to any colleagues who may not have been able to join us live and may benefit from attending this presentation. And on behalf of Wolf & Company, I thank you for being here. And if you do have any questions after the conclusion of this webinar, please feel free to reach out to Mike or Joe directly. Their information will be included in the slide deck. So I hope everyone has a great afternoon, and we hope to see you on future webinars. Thanks
all.
everyone.